Suppose in terms of winter, Halloween is a transitional time. So you're moving from the autumn into the winter, and a lot of people saw it that way. And there was also, it's a point at which there's a lot of the food reserves that they have built up over the summer that they know if they don't use them up, that they'll disappear. So the celebration of Halloween is a combination of these things. And it also goes back to the very ancient beliefs, the pre-Christian beliefs of this being a transitional time of the year. So spirits being able to transition even from their world into our world. So a combination of all those things led to the celebrations that we have around Halloween. It is the celebration of the start of winter, if you could call it a celebration. Winter was a really tough time of year for these people. It's a really poor time. They would refer to it as often as a poor time because it's when resources are often at their lowest for them. But they know that if they don't use up all of the fruit and all of the fresh food that they have in store at this time of year, then it's a waste as far as they're concerned. So the celebrations around Halloween, like ducking for apples, the hanging apples, all of those, and eating the fruits and nuts, is them gorging themselves leading into the winter, and it's using up that food. Even though in some ways it's almost a gluttonous use of the food, it's using up that food so it's just not wasted then over the winter months. So in terms then of like protecting themselves at this time of year, there's a lot of different stories, there's a lot of different folklores around protection. I suppose one of the key things and one of the materials that shows up over and over and over again as a protective material is wrought iron. Iron is a material that comes after the fairies. So the fairies aren't very familiar with iron and they're scared of it. And it's one of the materials that we can use to protect ourselves from the wily ways of the fairies. And of course the fairies are notorious at this time of year. There's a lot of different things happening, but one of the things you have to look out for is the fairies. And so wrought iron, particularly fresh wrought iron from blacksmith, was something that you could use to protect yourself. So people would hang the tongs over the door, for example, on Halloween Eve and All Souls Eve to stop the evil spirits getting through the door. Or they might hang them over the fireplace because the door was often protected by a bridges cross anyway. So you might hang the tongs over the fireplace at night just to make sure they didn't sneak in through the chimney. It's a transitional thing again. The cross is a universal protective. A lot of people would carry a rosary beads with them because of course the rosary has the crucifix on it. They would make small crosses from any kind of material. Straw usually was a very common one. And these would be blessed leading up to Halloween, and they were used for protecting entrances to the household. If you didn't have a bridges crossover, if you were fortunate enough to have a front and a back door, you'd have to protect those two entrances. That's where the turnip comes in, and we'll talk about that in a few moments, and the uses behind the turnip. But the use of the cross is very much, it's a religious symbol, so it's one of the symbols of Christianity, but it transcends that in that it's brought into a lot of the folklore. Like the jack-o'-lantern, the story behind the jack-o'-lantern and its creation. The crucifix appears in that, even though the story itself is much more ancient. I suppose it's been modernized several times, but the actual original story of the jack-o'-lantern, the crucifix was brought into that as those stories became Christianized. What would often happen is you would often have what was referred to generally as a visiting house in a community. And this was the house that was known for people. You could always go there. There'd always be a bit of crack, a few songs, storytelling. It was the house where everyone knew if you wanted a good night, that's where you congregate. And part of this celebration was the rhymers or the visors. And what they would do is they would go around from house to house. And I think this is where our trick-or-treating tradition comes from in the modern in the modern Halloween celebrations. So the rhymers would go round from house to house, and everyone had a character to play. So you had Patrick and Cromwell, all of these people from Irish history, and they would act out a little play at each household. And as payment for this, you would give what you could spare to the party that everyone was going to join. The whole community would be involved in. And it was this giving of something. Now, if you were a stooge and you didn't want to give anything, that's when things could turn nasty and there could be a trick played on you. This goes over to America with Irish immigrants, and while it's over there, it turns into trick or treating. So either you give us a treat or we will play a trick. And it's in some ways a simplified version of the rhyming tradition. So when the rhymers went round, they gathered what everyone could spare, and everyone would then go to this visiting house, and there would be a big celebration. There would be lots of food, drink if it was available. The whole family was involved, from the youngest to the oldest, and there was all sorts of games that were played around that. Now, some of these games were just played for the fun of playing them, but most of them were, like, again, dunking for apples, the hanging apple, snap apple. All of those different games were using up the fruits that, again, they knew they couldn't store. They wouldn't last. But some games had like a portent for the future. So there was a lot of divination around this time of year, because again, it's that transitional time, and it's one of those times where even the ordinary person can have a little peek beyond the curtain that separates us from the other world. So in order to do this, for example, one of the things they would do is they would heat lead on the fire until it was liquid. And they would get the key, and you know the eye at the end of those big wrought iron keys, you would pour a drop of lead through that into water. And when it hit the water, of course, lead cools very quickly. So when it hit the water, it would cool in a shape, and you would interpret the shape. So a horse might mean you were traveling, or a boat, if it looked like a boat, it means you were probably going to immigrate. If it looked even remotely like a love heart, you were going to get married. All of these different things. And so people could interpret what they wanted, in some cases, out of these. So that was one that was open, very much open to interpretation. But another game then was one where they would set out a set of plates or bowls on the table. They would put soil in one, there'd be a coin in another, there would be soil, coin, water was another common one. And they would lay these out, and you were blindfolded, and you would be spun round 3 times, the usual kind of thing for these games. And you would put your hand out, and whatever plate you touched, that was your future. So the soil was death, being buried. Of course, you didn't want that one. And the coin was that you were going to come into money over the next 12 months. The water was that you were going to, again, to travel, so you'd be going across the sea. Immigration was very common. Shows up quite a lot in the folklore, because of course a lot of people around this time, immigration was pretty much all they had to look forward to. So that was another game that was played. And of course then there was storytelling. Which is like this is the time of year for the storyteller. Long dark nights, this is when they come into their own. During the summer months, of course, they'd be popular, but at this time of the year, this is when they're in their element. And every community would have 1 or 2 scéaltóirs, so 1 or 2 good storytellers. Everybody could spin a tale, everybody could play a tune, everybody could maybe dance a few steps. Everyone had something they could do at a party like this. Their little party piece, I guess, but there were 1 or 2 characters who were renowned for their ability to spin a tale. And this night in particular, it could go on into the wee hours of the morning if you had a good storyteller. And it was one of the things, again, one of the pieces of folklore, that if you had a travelling storyteller and they were going through your village, particularly at this time of year, you would not turn them from the door. It was incredibly bad manners, but it is also incredibly bad luck. Because you would bring them into the house and you would treat them as an honoured guest, because people recognise the importance in the stories, in the folklore. And all stories have their own little moral behind them. There's a reason why people are told not to do this. Look what happened to him because he did this. So they recognise the moral reasoning behind this and the importance of those stories being passed on. And so anyone who could retain and tell those stories in a good, entertaining way was seen as being hugely important. So that was one of the things you would never do, is turn a storyteller away from the door.